Good evening. Welcome to the Indiana University Cinema Virtual Screening Room. My name is Alyssa Brooks, and I'm the Marketing and Programming Coordinator at IU Cinema. We're so glad to be back in our virtual screening room, but we miss being with all of you in person, and we hope you and your loved ones are staying healthy and well. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that IU Cinema is built and operates on the ancestral lands of the indigenous people of the Miami, Potawatomi, Delaware, and Shawnee nations. On behalf of the entire IU Cinema team, I'd like to thank you for joining us for tonight's screening of the 2017 documentary, Whose Streets?, directed by Sabah Folayan and co-directed by Damon Davis. This is the first event in the Themester 2020 Democracy Series in partnership with the College of Arts and Sciences and the Center for Research on Race and Ethnicity in Society. We first screened Whose Streets in 2017, and we're honored to present it again tonight alongside a robust discussion between several activists and scholars. To introduce the film, I'd like to welcome Martin Law, a PhD candidate in the Department of Communication and Culture at IU and core council member of Black Lives Matter Bloomington. Martin completed his MA in Rhetoric and Public Culture here at IU, and his work focuses on disability studies, sound studies, and race. He's taught many courses in communication studies and is developing courses on whiteness and hip hop, persuasion and protest, and intersectional disability and rhetoric. Please welcome Martin Law.
Hello. So the 2017 film, Whose Streets, presents what director Sabah Folayan describes as the transformation of the activist ecology of the US following the 2014 lynching of Michael Brown by the Ferguson, Missouri Police Department. Now, this metaphor of an activist ecology is powerful and compelling because it highlights the ways that activism is rarely or maybe never done by individuals. Even as much as we often see stories that tell of individual heroism, elevating people out of their context. Instead, activism almost always is a product of people working in interconnected, interdependent, and intimately entangled ways with one another. Whose Streets is able to tell this story in part because co-director Damon Davis claims, as co-director Damon Davis says in his in an interview, he was right nearby when the event happened. He said within hours he was hearing reports of a killing and that people were gathering in the streets of Ferguson. He says at that point they were calling it a gathering. It wasn't yet a protest. But we all know that within days that gathering had gone beyond a protest and turned into an uprising. And that uprising over the course of several months had become a movement whose echoes we still hear today in Kenosha, Wisconsin, in Rochester, New York, in Louisville, Kentucky, in my hometown of Minneapolis, Minnesota, as well as in Indianapolis and Bloomington, Indiana. Now, based on that echo metaphor, if we were in the IU Cinema right now, I might take the opportunity to do some call and response. Of course, Whose Streets is a reference to a chant. And Whose Streets on its own, without the response, well, it's incomplete. I also know that some 6 months into the isolation, quarantine, and distancing we've been doing, to call attention to everything that's different now can be trite or even cliche, but I'm doing it for a reason. I'm doing it to call attention to the fact, and a fact that Whose Streets, again, wants us to pay attention to, that activism is always changing. That the way we do things today is different than it would have been 6 months ago. The way we do things in Bloomington, Indiana is different than it would be in Minneapolis, in Rochester, in Kenosha, in Louisville. Not merely because we're in different places, and not merely because there have been so many further state-sanctioned killings since Michael Brown, and not merely because of the pandemic, but because of all of those things and more. Because we all exist within deep ecologies of activism that call on us to always be aware of the changing state of our interconnectedness, of our interdependence, and of our deep, intimate entanglements. So, bearing in mind the calls that this film is making to us, we all need, as we watch and as we go forward after watching this film, to think about how we are going to respond to our changing activist ecologies.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you again for joining us. I'm looking forward to this discussion and to your questions. We'll start with a conversation between our panelists, and about 30 minutes in, we'll begin answering audience questions. Please feel free to begin typing questions into the Q&A box at any time, which you can reach by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I'll start by introducing our moderator, Freya Thimsen, who will then introduce the rest of our panel. Freya is an assistant professor in the Rhetoric, Writing, and Communication program in the Department of English. She teaches in the minor in Communication and Public Advocacy. Her research explores the relationship between movement politics that are radical and those that are more conventional. She writes about how democracy is performed through different kinds of communication technologies, including digital engagement and street protest. She's working on a book about the influence of the Occupy demonstrations on more mainstream styles of anti-corporate politics. Please welcome Freya Thimsen.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Thanks, Alyssa, for that introduction and for coordinating us all and getting us all organized. I'd also, before we get started, like to quickly thank the IU Cinema for screening this fantastic film, and the Democracy Themester and the Center for Research on Race and Ethnicity in Society for sponsoring this event. We have a great collection of panelists tonight to help us unpack this film and make some connections to our current moment. This film is obviously more relevant than ever, and I'm really excited to hear what our panelists have to say about it. So to get started, I'd like to introduce Andrea Sterling. Andrea is a doctoral student in the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies at IU. Her research on collectivity, Black social movements, Black radical thought, and media representation focuses on the mechanics of oppressive ideologies, specifically anti-Blackness and white supremacy in the US context. Andrea, thanks for getting us started. Why don't you go ahead and give us your thoughts?
Great. Good evening, everyone. So I wanted to start with us thinking about the common understanding of democracy as a form of government in which the people who exist within that civil society have a say, have a voice, have authority in governance. The idea being that we elect representatives who will represent the people. But we have to ask, who are the people being represented? Who's considered a genuine member of our American society? There's no way to really answer these questions without thinking about the role of citizenship, what citizenship is, and who has access to it. Being a citizen is clearly not enough, not if you've been constructed as antithetical, outside of, or beyond the citizen. While we try to parse through an understanding of citizenship and democracy, we have to take an honest look at the condition of Blackness and Black people within the context of the United States. Regardless of what is written on paper or stamped onto passports, can we honestly say that the lived reality for Black communities in America meets the necessary and sufficient conditions of the citizen? And if we cannot, then what conditions seem most applicable? And would that help us get a better understanding of how we seem to live in this never-ending loop of Black death, uprising, and backlash? To answer my own question, I turned to Martinican artist and social theorist Ame Cezaire. In a speech delivered in '56, Cezaire argues for an understanding of how the condition of Black Americans suffering under racial domination can be understood as a colonial condition. He notes that Black people in America are, quote, by force of racial discrimination, artificially placed at the heart of a great modern nation in a situation that is comprehensible only in reference to a colonialism, abolished to be sure, but one whose after effects still reverberate in the present, end quote. Cezaire is not alone in this understanding of the resounding after effects of colonialism as it pertains to the Black condition. Saidiya Hartman in Lose Your Mother brings the term Afterlife of Slavery into the forefront, which might feel even more accurate for our specific history within the United States. Hartman's understanding of the afterlife of slavery is similar to Cezaire's discussion of the after effects of colonialism. Both use terms that force the listener to understand how the past infects the present and to see that the rupture formed by colonialism hasn't closed. We should understand this as a call to see the contemporary life of Black people as one forming under a colonial and enslaved condition. Even as the superficial tools of domination have changed, the root of the disease remains the same. This is why one of the epigraphs of the film is so important to register as a framing for the film itself. The Dred Scott decision, where they said, quote, in the opinion of the court, neither the class of persons who had been imported as slaves nor their descendants were acknowledged as part of the people and so had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, end quote. There is therefore no way to have a genuine conversation about Black culture, Black life, Black death within the realm of the United States without at the same time having a conversation about the problems of colonialism. This perhaps then can help us make better sense of why we can witness what is undeniable injustice over and over again and see little recompense. This is why we see people fighting for their lives, to be seen as full human beings. And the common response from the voyeurs is that the injustice is not the anti-Black violence, but rather how those who have been affected have chosen to protest and fight for their right to live freely. So as we move forward, digesting this documentary and the commentary to follow, I want us to keep this in mind, to understand that the only true way forward is to take an honest audit of where we are now. We must question these terms we've taken for granted and put our blind faith in: democracy, citizenship, these terms which lock us in and skew the reality of the present. When we hold fast to the myth of existing in a truly democratic society, it is unsurprising that Black resistance, social life, and assertion of humanity is met with such violent fervor. If we cannot recognize the para-colonial conditions that define and inform our present-day society, then we'll continue to repeat this violent and tragic loop that we're in. Lastly, while I focused on how society constructs and thinks about Blackness, I do hope that in our conversation moving forward, we also make room to recognize that despite these constructions of Black folks, we still live, love, and exist as the full and multiplicitous humans that we are, that our joy is radical resistance. That should also be a major takeaway of the film, as it purposely made space to allow this. There are so many ways to resist. We need to recognize Black love and community as an ultimate resistance as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea, for those thoughts. There's a lot there that we can talk about. I'm gonna draw in our next panelist for the conversation. Her name is Abby Ong. She's also a PhD candidate, but in the Department of English. She's completing a dissertation focusing on 12th to 15th century human-insect encounters. And alongside academia, Ong is also the founder and lead organizer for No Space for Hate, which is a coalition of community members who confront and expose local white supremacist activities through education, direct action, and community building. She co-organizes an Indiana chapter of the National Asian Pacific Women's Forum and is also the vice president of the Monroe County National Organization for Women. So Abby, could you, and Abby has also dropped a link to a presentation in the chat if anyone wants to take a look at it. Go ahead, Abby.
So it's not so much a presentation, but just like a slide that someone made called the City of Bloomington Free Speech Zone. My friend photoshopped that for me. And so my remarks today are going to be about democracy and its relation to free speech. At the beginning of the documentary, we saw the quote from Martin Luther King Jr. about how a riot is the language of the unheard. And so I'm going to talk to you about whose speech is valued, whose speech is actually valued in a democracy. And when rules around free speech are made, who do those rules actually affect? And for this example, I'm going to take something very local. And so through my work on No Space for Hate, which is an organization that I started after activists brought to light a local farmer, Sarah Dye's ties to the American Identity Movement, which is a white nationalist organization implicated in the violent Unite the Right rally at Charlottesville. So after it was brought to the public's attention in a very public way, the mayor released several statements in response, and his statements affirmed the First Amendment right of all people to their free speech, including both the free speech of members of white nationalist organizations to state their beliefs, as well as encouraging protesters to exercise their free speech against white nationalist hate. Initially, he did encourage protesters to continue protesting and using their free speech as an antidote to hate. But throughout that season of protest, what was reinforced repeatedly to those who spoke out was that rules about free speech, which was ideally supposed to protect dissenters and socially marginalized, often eschewed to protect the powerful. And an example of this is the time, manner, and place restrictions at the local farmers market that suddenly emerged retroactively, framed as long-standing rules after the arrest of Dr. Kara Kadu on those grounds for merely holding a sign peacefully. And so too are the free speech zones that the city instituted earlier this year in the new farmers market rules. And that's kind of what I'm referring to when I have that slide of the dumpster saying City of Bloomington Free Speech Zone. The idea of the free speech zones was that people could protest, but they could protest away from where the central action was, and as a result, make the protest less effective and make it easier to ignore people's dissent. And here too at IU, the recent posting of flyers labeled IU Woke Enough show the ways in which marginalized faculty and graduate student instructors are often placed at risk for their own speech. These flyers state that students who are not allowed to dissent with ultra-woke faculty over issues like implicit bias and white privilege should post documentation online, on Twitter and YouTube and other media. And sure enough, the ultra-woke faculty are often Black, Indigenous, and people of color faculty and graduate students. And these actions expose them for harassment and death threats. And these are populations who are already a minority in a largely white town and university. And so the question I hope people will continue to keep in mind is whose free speech is protected and whose free speech is actually valued. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Abby. Some good connections to some of the work that you and others have been doing here in town. Our next panelist is Micol Seigel. She's a professor in the departments of American Studies and History. Her most recent book, Violence Work, State Power and the Limits of Police, is on police border crossing in the Americas. Her research is concerned with race in the Americas, mass incarceration, and colonialism. She helped found Decarcerate Monroe County in around 2008 and Indiana Against Decarceration last year. She also helped found the Critical Prison Cities Caucus of the American Studies Association, and she's a longtime member of Critical Resistance. Nicole.
Thanks so much, Freya. It's an honor to be a part of this panel and to be asked to think with all of you, including the audience, I hope, about this really important film. I guess the thing that the film makes me feel now watching it again in the post-George Floyd moment is something about the kinetic energy of protest. And by kinetic, I want to emphasize the fire. I think Tef Po says that these protests were not made for TV. That is certainly true, but this film does manage to convey an enormous amount of what's really vital about them. The intensity and the energy, the fury and just how incredibly deep the wrongs are that have been inflicted on people in the city of Ferguson. And now we know a couple other particular places that we could cite, but we can say this in any city and many other kinds of burbs across the America, that this kind of injustice is constant and is constantly wearing people down. The feeling of being in this, one of the participants says, an invisible war, stokes so much rage, and that rage doesn't just dissipate, it goes places. And one of the places that it goes is into the intensity of protest, into the fires this time, as James Baldwin said. There's so much salt in the wounds, just constantly being poured on the wounds by reiterated abuses of an unbelievably similar kind. I think one of the things that we can't help but feel as we watch this movie about Ferguson in the George Floyd moment is, how can this possibly be happening again in this identical way? It's unlivable, it's unthinkable, and yet it is the everyday, it is the utter simplicity of the way that this country is organized in this world, honestly. I want to just focus on one moment in the film. It's the moment where Obama comes on stage and says, "There's never an excuse for violence." Remember that little bit. It's just after the scene where there's an incredible discussion in a barbershop. And a barbershop is one of the places that Fred Moten and Stefano Harney think of as the quintessential site for the undercommons, the place where people are creating other ways of being and living. And the wisdom and the knowledge, even the quantitative statistics shared in this barbershop conversation underline that so profoundly for me. And then we move to Obama, the other side, the other side of the coin of the undercommons, the embodiment of state power, the sovereign. And Obama says there's never an excuse for violence. And the filmmakers do such a beautiful job of juxtaposing that ridiculous assertion with the incredible violence of the police, whose violence the sovereign is legitimizing by refusing to consider it violence. And we are dumped right back at the definition of the state as that body which is able to claim a monopoly on legitimate violence. That the sovereign, even in the form of a Black body, can say there's never an excuse for violence, while state violence is so profoundly in evidence. Just really breaks it down. It is just so clear that the state is the violence visited on the people who are understood as an obstacle to the maintenance of the status quo. And the kinetic energy that the rage of that realization produces, the rage, the fire, the salt in those wounds, is on some level in this film, it's deeply satisfying to see. It's satisfying to see people grabbing the tear gas canisters and throwing them back. It's satisfying to see them breaking windows and putting cars on fire. And I need to tell myself, and maybe it will help for me to also tell you, if you are feeling this too, that the Ferguson energy didn't go away. The George Floyd energy won't go away. It goes somewhere. It doesn't just dissipate. It gets channeled back into the energies that we continue to bring to fighting the unbelievable injustices that this film highlights for us and that we know surround us in every part of this country that wishes it could call itself a democracy.
Thanks for that, Nicole. There's a lot of really important themes that you're drawing out there and good connections to what Andrea and Abby have already given us too. I want to hear now from our next panelist. Her name is Leah DeRae. She's been an organizer with Indy10 Black Lives Matter organization in Indianapolis for over 5 years. Leah has spoken on contemporary Black liberation politics in a variety of forums before this one, including the Unapologetics podcast, the Humanities Action Lab, the Indianapolis Recorder, and Indianapolis Monthly, and we're lucky to have her here with us tonight. Leah, what are your thoughts about the film?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi. First of all, I would like to say thanks for having me. So I actually went to Ferguson a week after Michael Brown was murdered. And so a lot of it was just like a remembering or a reminder of what it was like while being down there. And I remember I was young, I was upset, and like I became activated, and it really prompted me and the peers that I went down there with to do action. And so when I see, when I watch the film, every time I watch it, it makes me think of obviously the great loss that was the life of Michael Brown, but it also makes me think of activation and what these moments and what these movements do to activate people who before might not have known how to fight against a system that has been so oppressive and so harmful for generations, right? So my initial thoughts made me think of community and activation and how every few years there is an uprising. And as tragic as that uprising is, it is also an opportunity to gather folks, to mobilize folks, and to build with people who could very well become victims of state violence themselves, or who have experienced a different level of state violence that is not necessarily police brutality, but is incarceration or underserved schools. So every time I think of Whose Streets, or I think of the film, I think of how I was on fire, just like the city was. I was angry, I was hurt, I was upset, and I was young. And I used, there was a young person behind me, my niece. It made me think about how I can get other people who are currently as young as I was back then, who are also on fire, who have also been activated, and what I can do to help bring them into this line of movement, into this line of work. And so it makes me think of the Dre John Reed case, who was a 21-year-old Black man who was killed May 6th by IMPD. And we went to the area the night that he was killed, and there were a bunch of young people out there who were upset. A lot of people who were his friends, who were his peers, who were 21, 22, and became activated, realized that, you know, this is something that I can fight against. You know, they did something to someone so close to me, so someone who looks just like me. This is what I can do. I can fight. You know, I have rage. Now it was my job as a person who has been organizing for many years to take that rage and to take those young people, those young powerhouse of people, and like turn them into people who knew that they could use this power. Well, not turn them, because like I don't want to take ownership, but like help them turn themselves into people who were dedicated to community and to make change. So every time I see the film, I think about community and what it looks like for us to see hurt, to see struggle, and to embrace each other, and to move along and build together a world that is built around people and not around injustice. Thank you.
He's introduced earlier by Alyssa. Martin's a doctoral student in communication and culture, and he's also a member of the core council of Bloomington's BLM chapter. Martin. Hi.
Hey, so I already got a chance to talk earlier, so I think keep it a little short. I really like what the previous panelists have said. Abby and Andrea really pointing out that law and rights aren't really a solution. They can't be a solution. They were never designed to be a solution. And so that leaves you with the question of, well, then what is there if it's not petitioning for rights, petitioning for different laws? And that's one of the things that like Micol, seeing this this documentary just reminds you of what it is like to be trying to do something that isn't just petitioning for rights, petitioning for new laws, but to simply be in community with other people who are, as Leah said, activated, on fire. And so that leads me, I guess, to a question that I've been thinking about for a while now, but that this documentary brought up for me again is, all right, so in a situation where it is perhaps less possible, less safe, to do that kind of being together, to be ignited by the kinetic energy of being together, how do we keep that energy going? How do we find ways to ignite young people, as Leah said, which I like a lot? That's terrific. What are the other methods for doing that? Certainly, again, I loved the director's comment in this interview I saw about an activist ecology. Any activist ecology has to be more than just one thing, more than just taking the streets. While that's really, really important, it seems like there has to be more. So that's one of the questions that this documentary brought up for me once again was, how do we do things now differently than might have been necessary, in Ferguson.
Yeah, the question that's on everyone's minds, and we've already seen, of course, like one level of response to that, which is we just do it anyway, right? We wear a mask. But there's a whole range of things that can be talked about under that category as well. So our final panelist is Rasul Mowatt. He's a professor in the Departments of American Studies and Geography. His primary areas of research are geographies of race, geographies of violence and threat, the animation of public space, and critical leisure studies. His published work has analyzed racially violent forms of leisure in the American Behavioral Scientist, the dangers of viewing images of Black death in biography, and most recently, the threat of violence from intimate terrorism, white nationalists in the state, in a special call for COVID-19 in the Leisure Sciences Journal. So, Rasul.
Is democracy something that's been corrupted over time in moments throughout U.S. history, or is democracy itself something that's corrupted and we are in need of another way of life? Dissent that results in protests is telling us something, but what? Are we listening accurately? Some scholars have looked at protests, riots, strikes, rebellions, and revolts, typically mention or even situate the basis for protests in the worsening of lived conditions of everyday citizens. This is as true in 1820 as it was in 1920, as it is now in 2020. Protest is just this. Protest is the response to the failures of governance. Since democracy is a form of governance here, then it is a response to the politics, policies, politicians, and the policing of and by the state. But once again, conditions resulting from stagnant economic growth, exclusionary state-sanctioned violence, and uprisings of those left without reserves are telling us something. Protests can be marches and rallies, they can be riots and strikes, and looting can occur. The moment and the conditions dictate what we'll see. Again, whether it's marches, rallies, demonstrations, strikes, riots, or rebellions. But why? And why now? And why at other times throughout history? And also, why does protest take certain forms at certain points in history? In the early 1800s, riots and insurrections were prominent due to the exploitations inherently in capitalism for the poorly paid laborer and the enslaved laborer. In the 1820s, some of the most prominent riots were of women working in mills in the Northeast. And also in the 1820s, Denmark Vesey's conspiracy for revolt took place in South Carolina. In 1920, on the island of Oahu, a multiracial strike of 3 labor unions rallied against sugar plantation owners. Just the year before, the Great Steel Strike of 1919, which began in September, but ended in January 1920. Not to mention the ongoing race riots levied at Black citizenry on the ongoing basis, which began in East St. Louis in 1917 to 1921 with the Tulsa Race Massacre. But with both of these time periods, the living conditions of many were taxed by the government on behalf of the wealthy. State actors disproportionately targeted Black, Latinx, Indigenous, immigrants, and poor white Southerners with heavy police repression. If you walked down the street in a certain way and looked a certain way, arrest or death. If you worked inadequately or exceptionally, arrest or death. If you protested this reality, arrest or death. If this is what will occur, then many simply refuse to not take it anymore. Triggering moments are the enough is enough. The Watts riots, which turned into rebellion in 1965, was triggered by the beating of Rena Price with a blackjack by police who challenged the arrest of her sons in front of her fellow residents of Watts. But the triggering moment is felt, but it is also seen. And so this brings us to 2020, as well as what is depicted in the film. In 2014, the triggering event was not only the killing of Michael Brown, but it was also the leaving of his lifeless body on the ground for 4 hours. The triggering event was not only, for now, the triggering event was not only the killing of George Floyd, but also the reason for his death, the alleged fake $20 bill. And those triggering events, the killing, opens the doorway for us to know of the legions of others that have been killed, but the events are the vehicle to voice the disdain in the closing of schools, the lack of health care, joblessness, etc. And I thought it was exceptionally important for the documentary to begin with those types of conversations in the car that turned into actions on the streets.
All right, great. Thank you all so much. This is a lot. I think I can think of a lot of sort of ways to organize your comments and draw out some commonalities, but before I do that, does anyone want to sort of amplify or refine or just add to the comments that you heard from anybody else? Like, does anyone want to just sort of point at something that somebody else said and say, yes, that, or draw in a question? All right, so I'll go ahead and say this. I think it's so interesting how so many of you are talking about the energy and the passion and the fire that is part of activation. That's part of that this film captures so much better than most documentaries about protests or movements. There's this sense of the kind of vitality, the love that the community has for, is trying to draw out for itself and express the anger. And I feel like part of that is about the kind of video footage that's included in the film. And so it's not just, what's filmed by the filmmakers themselves or the camera people they're working with. A lot of the footage is culled from YouTube, right? Like it's footage from people's phones. It's people who were there who gave them the footage somehow. And so, some people like to say, right, like you're saying, Rasul, there's some things that are new here and there's some things that aren't. And some people like to say it's the cameras that are new, right? That's what's new. And so I was just wondering if you all could sort of speak to that, like what you see as the importance of that kind of, like the moving images of the film itself, like the way that it's shot, the way that it's put together, but then also like the role of video in Black liberation politics in general right now, and like what it means for producing that energy or fire. Yeah, Nicole.
I of course, as a historian, think there's nothing new under the sun, but I think that what makes this film so powerful is not the kind of footage, but the fact that the filmmakers, Sabah and Darren Davis, are they're participants and they're Black, and they are in the community that considers them part of it. They are doing what they are filming. So they're not the kind of outside eye that, in the one scene you see the cop watch guy get really angry at alternate media, not at the mainstream media, but at independent filmmakers, because they're there filming, disrupting, invading his privacy for some sort of a story that has become controversial. And that's not what these filmmakers are doing. They're making this film as a form of struggle. They're not trying to be witness to struggle. They're fomenting it, augmenting it, rejoicing in it. They are part of the, they're some of the folks who get harassed, who hug the speakers, who cry. They're not separate from it. And I don't think that the technology is nearly as important as that about perspective. And I also want to say that I love the word activate, Leah. It makes me think of chemistry, like some kind of reagent has been, created. I don't know what the catalyst is many things. I think mostly it's the experience of being oppressed. I could use a 4-letter word, but I think to be activated in that kind of material way is a great way to frame it.
Yeah, and I'd probably like to jump in, just to extend what my colleague has just sort of spoken to. I think there's a caution that we have to also make in terms of thinking about is something new happening, right? Especially with technology, and in this respect, no, the idea and the actual thing of police shooting and killing people has been going on for quite some time. And people have used whatever that was available to them to spread the word, to document it, to use it as a rallying point in some particular way. And so while in this particular case, they were able to take a bunch of the footage that they had and pull it together into a documentary, as they kind of they speak to this in another panel later on. And they talk about the fact that was not necessarily their initial intent, was to create a documentary at all. And this is why also a lot of the footage wasn't seen. It was not posted on Facebook beforehand or anything like that. And so once they began to realize that their stories were being commoditized by others, they knew that they had a responsibility to sort of pull all this content together. So on one hand, I want to sort of say that they had the intent, and just to sort of extend that sort of point a little bit more, but also want to say that there's a caution with thinking that somehow technology enhances the messaging that gets us to activate more people, in the words of Leah.
Yeah, Andrea.
I would also kind of follow up thinking about the use of technology and the viral video, the viral photo of Black protests, but also Black death, right, and Black violence, which, to kind of reiterate what they've been saying, it's not new when we think about this with how, the nonviolence movement used media, or how abolitionists use images of the wounded and scarred backs of the enslaved. And so we're kind of like in the midst of this, though, where we pick up our phone, we open our laptops, and we're constantly seeing these type of videos on a loop, and how damaging they can be. It's a double-edged sword, because the idea is consciousness raising, let people know what's going on, which has been the intention, right, all of those other times as well. But we're also being re-traumatized with these images again and again. And so what I really appreciated about the documentary was how they included such a fullness of life, that it wasn't just what was happening on the street, this idea of purely being activists, like as activist TM, but really showing that they're full beings, full people with full lives, with love, with friendship and community, because that is what really kind of adds to, as Nicole was talking about, the kinetic energy. well, what's keeping these flames going, right? It's not just the reaction to whatever's happened in the moment. It's that community, it's that love that keeps it pushing. And I'm really grateful that the film showed that. I think having that balance of showing the fullness of Black resistance.
Thanks for that. I think that Alyssa's appeared and she hopefully has some good questions from the audience.
Yeah.
Alyssa, is there one you want to start with?
Sure. Yeah, so I'll be reading questions from the audience. We'll get to as many as we can. And just a reminder, everyone, you can submit your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So to start, touching on you talking about community, Andrea, and also something Martin touched on earlier, can we talk a little bit about what activism looks like right now in the time of COVID-19? How do we fight for safety from police violence while keeping ourselves and communities safe? And what new tactics have emerged out of this time?
I'll go. So we were put in a difficult predicament in May 6th when Dre John Marie was killed. People were already gathered. People were already upset. And so we can't tell people to go home. It doesn't make sense to tell people to social distance in the midst of their trauma. And so the best thing that we could do as people who care about community and want us to have like our righteous rage, but also want us to be safe, is provide PPE the best that we can, right? So we asked immediately for mask donations and brought those to every protest that we had. After George Floyd, there was several days, like 12 days straight of uprisings and protests downtown in Indianapolis. And so we felt like the best thing that we could do was to remind people that while you're out here, please wear masks, mask up, on top of also providing people with goggles and Maalox and milk to defend against the tear gas. So while we were also trying to protect against this disease that is killing Black people at alarming rates, we are also, this virus, we are also out here trying to make sure that people are safe because COVID-19 is a respiratory illness and the police are using tear gas on protesters, and so which affects the respiratory system. And so what we can do is just let people know, like, hey, if you cannot be out here, if you live with someone who is immunocompromised, or if you yourself are immunocompromised, then the best thing that you can do is maybe stay home and participate in resistance another way. So we provided alternatives to being out in the streets. You could email, you could call, you could be a drop-off location for medical supplies that people were donating, and then we could come and pick it up from your doorstep, you know? So there's a way for all people of all abilities to be involved and to fight against oppression. And there's a way that we can do it. It's not ideal to be fighting for our lives or to be fighting for justice in the middle of a global pandemic, but you know, those are things that we are called to do. And so if we must be in the streets and if we must make noise, let us at least try to make it make sense for us. And so we also provided food, because a lot of the times we will be out there for 12 hours, you know. And so if we're gonna have food for people, make sure we have hand sanitizer and hand washing stations, and make sure that we know we have masks, and make sure if we found out that anyone within the circle or within the process had been COVID positive, then we would just make sure that we would be transparent about that. But there's not really a good way to fight against state violence while also protecting yourself from a virus that we don't know anything about.
Nicole?
I also just want us to remember that, you know, what activism looks like in the era of COVID is just the same as activism looks in any other moment. It looks about 9 million different ways. And one of the things that COVID calls our attention to is the incredible disparity in quality of life, in environmental racism, in food deserts, in racism in the healthcare system, in the absence of healthcare, and the use of racist police instead of healthcare and mental health care. And so activism against COVID itself is activism for healthcare and for better living conditions. And, you know, writ large, against racism, period, since racism, one of my favorite definitions is the geographer Ruthie Gilmore's of the state-sanctioned differentiation in premature death. Wait, somebody help me out here. The state-sanctioned increased vulnerability to premature death. That is the definition of racism that Ruthie Gilmore prefers. So under COVID, you know, we see all of the intensifications of racism making people of color, making Black people sicker and die more from COVID. So activism, you know, just as leadership takes many forms, activism takes many forms. It's not just the going out into the streets. We're all responding to specific provocations in particular historical contexts. And so let's not lose sight of the millions of different kinds of things that we can do and have to do in this moment.
And I would also like to add that as part of the work that No Space for Hate did, we started a Monroe County mutual aid network. So in terms of activism, the mutual aid network was a really, really good, for us, way for people to get plugged in and help people get food who are homebound, help people get access to stuff. And especially as the protests were going on in Bloomington, it became a really important hub for people to say, hey, I need some PPE, or where can I get, can someone drop off some bottled water for people experiencing homelessness in Seminary Park? So I just see that as one of the mutual aid efforts, as one of the important ways in which where people can ask without judgment, give without judgment, according to what they have to offer, and then in accordance with what people need.
Thank you all for that. I'm going to ask another question from the audience. This is from Sierra. The decision not to indict Darren Wilson hurt people. It was heartbreaking. That said, now and in the future, should racial justice activists demand that cops who've murdered people be indicted? Can racial justice be achieved through the prison industrial complex?
The easy questions, huh?
Well, if no one else wants to jump on to this, well, okay. Well, to the last question, I guess ultimately the answer is probably no. It seems unlikely that you could ever achieve anything like justice through incarcerating more people. If nothing else, if we start incarcerating more people, it's going to disproportionately affect, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Even if we throw a couple of cops in too, it's not a winning solution. But at the same time, that doesn't mean we, the failure to indict was condoning the behavior. Until we stop condoning the behavior, we can't get anywhere toward actual moves toward justice, meaning helping the community heal, giving the community resources to heal. By not indicting Darren Wilson, you're, again, to go back to the Malcolm X metaphor, you're just leaving the knife where it is. You're not getting anywhere toward taking it out. So no, obviously incarceration is not going to lead to racial justice, but recognizing that there was an injury and beginning to take account of how you can hold people responsible for doing the work of healing the damage they did, that's what's got to happen. Yeah.
Can I just say I love the form of the question, because it isn't the usual form. You know, usually it comes in some other way, right? Like, how can we hold the cops accountable, or why doesn't this happen, or what do we need to do in order to hold the cops accountable? But this questioner, Sierra, what you're saying, you already have within your question a critique, right? This is a question that obviously understands that it's impossible to use the criminal justice system to protect ourselves from the criminal justice system. And it suggests to me that there's been more and more, water under this bridge, and that there is, we're in some sort of watershed moment where there's a really great wide understanding that kind of reform is not going to get us anywhere. That we're not going to be able to hold the state accountable for state violence. It doesn't let us do that. That's not how it works. It's the opposite.
And just to chime in, I think that's a place that people evolve into. I mean, you grow in activism, and again, I highly recommend people to look at least a couple of the panels that the two filmmakers, Sabah and Damon, were on. One of which they actually speak to the fact that prior to the demonstration, the night of potentially Darren Wilson's indictment, which did not happen. Somebody asked, the crowd of activists that were there prepping for the demonstration, did they believe that, Darren Wilson was going to be indicted? And the two filmmakers said the entire room bursted out laughing because they knew full well that was not going to be the case. It doesn't mean that the outrage is still not going to be real, but they knew going into it that the point was still to continue the fight. So there was still to go out there and conduct a demonstration, even though they knew the indictment was not going to happen, as we know in all these other particular cases. So on one hand, there's this evolution that we grow into. I know many people are talking about, police abolition this particular summer, even though there's been decades of work, around that area. I think that's one thing that people have to grow into. But the other part is that even when you know that the state is going to operate in this particular way, the rest of your people don't know. And so it's the sort of fight and the work that helps to educate them on not only the failures of the state, but also the need to take care of your own.
We have time for one or two more questions. So this question is from Natalie. Do you think this film's target audience was non-Black people who still require images of violence against Black people to believe it's happening? Or does this film target Black people as encouragement, celebration? What do you feel is the film's main message, and who do you feel it's for?
Just to jump in, I think in our prep, I mentioned to my colleagues here that there is a sort of a sad part about this documentary, because many of the people who are depicted are no longer with us, all from very questionable deaths. And Sabah and Damon actually do speak to this, but they also have it at the end of the film. I think first, the film is a love note to all of their fellow activists and organizers. So I think that's one of the first things, that while other people are viewing it, including us, it was their love letter to these people, because it captured a moment in time where they all were together and they were all fighting for this particular common cause. But additionally, I think they also spoke to it in an additional panel, that they were also trying to articulate the need for other people to also wake up and to also respond to the injustices that are happening in their own particular cities and communities.
I'd like to also turn the question around and ask us all to think about what we could do with this film. The author's intent is one thing, but here it is in the world, it exists, it's its own free flowing object. A lot of us are teachers, and others of us are members of communities that could sit around and, you know, have a movie night with popcorn and enjoy the incredible inspiration and energy and lessons of this film. So I think, you know, this is one for the ages. When in a couple of decades we'll look back and say, oh yes, you know, the Ferguson, the George Floyd moment, just as people talk now about the 60s. And this film does a great job of capturing the kind of energy and capturing also, yeah, the love and the nourishment that activism provides people who do it together.
All right, if no one has anything to add, I'll ask a final question. Go ahead, Andrea.
Yeah, so I just want to kind of roll it back a little bit to and not to be too precise about the language, but I still think the idea that anyone requires these images to be like a false idea at this point, because it's so clear, especially now with what has been happening in the last several months. It's pretty hard to believe that there are folks who still need their eyes opened. I think, in fact, some people are becoming more desensitized to it, or they are getting to a place where they are recognizing, whether consciously or subconsciously, that they don't really care too much about Black death or Black violence, that is the standard. And that's why we see all of this response to protests, to people reacting, because it's not the Black death, it's not the Black violence that's seen as the injustice, it's us speaking up about it. So I would just kind of push back on the idea that there are still folks who really require the images. I think that there are other ways of reaching people and getting them to kind of see what's happening and access some level of empathy. And I think that for us to even begin talking about empathy, we do also have to unpack the fact that folks do not fully see Black people as human, which is where and why they struggle with the empathy part. And so I think that the film has, and to second kind of what Micol was saying too, that we should ask ourselves, what can we get from the film? And I think that the film has a lot to offer for all different groups. And I want more people who are outside of the Black community to be able to watch a documentary like this and not just see the trauma. I think that is a first step and a first question. What happens when you see a whole bunch of Black life and you still only narrow in on the trauma? Does that then maybe indicate that in some way you're defining Blackness by trauma in and of itself?
Yeah, and Andrea, I think that's a really good point. And in some ways, you know, if we look at this documentary, they really don't show a lot. I mean, they don't show violence against Black people nearly as much as was available, nearly as much as the news did. There were no images of Michael Brown. There were images of people being very violently arrested, but even those were not close up. They were not, you know, they didn't revel in the violence. And so I agree with you, Andrea, that I don't think there's anyone out there who needs these images in order to be convinced that it's happening. I do think there's people out here who need the images, though. In fact, they need it for the opposite reason. They need it, you know, I would argue. So this is one of the things that occurred to me while watching the George Floyd video, which I did eventually, is that like leaving Michael Brown's body out for 4 hours, it's important that it is seen so that everybody knows, that everybody is aware that this death, it doesn't matter, right? That it can be done and that nobody is scared of the consequences. You can't slowly lynch someone over the course of 9 minutes while being observed in broad daylight and photographed unless, you know, by accident, right? You know that is what you are going for. You need to demonstrate. And, you know, if we think about, again, the particularity of our time, this is a time when Everything is in disarray. Everyone is uncertain. Everybody is in a position of precarity. Nobody knows if they might get a virus that leads to a disease that kills them very shortly. But there's one thing that white people know, and that's that they could not be lynched in the street over the course of 9 minutes in broad daylight while being filmed. That could never happen to them. And in fact, the lynching of George Floyd was simply a demonstration of that. And so it is an image that people need, but not to prove that it's happening, but instead to prove that it could never happen to them.
I think I just want to add that I think this film educates in a couple of ways that are important beyond its depiction of the love and the energy of the activist community in Ferguson. I think it also educates on the difference between what the media shows about protests and what's actually happening. I think that's, you know, for many people who have participated in protests in the last 5 months who hadn't before, that there's a new level of awareness about what makes it on the news and what doesn't. This film does a great job with that. And it also does a great job with depicting how militarized the police are. And, you know, it's one thing to say the police are militarized. It's another thing to see somebody lay out the artillery shells on his coffee table, or to see the armored vehicle driving through the streets. Those aren't things that you get on the news either. So I don't know if there are other ways to accomplish that education, but those are things that struck me. Was there another question, Alyssa?
Yeah, I'll ask one more and then I'll leave it to you guys if you have any final comments you want to make before we wrap up. But my last question from the audience, do you think this moment in time will inspire a new generation of activists? Does that make you feel hopeful for the future, or afraid that we'll still need the same kind of protests 20, 30, 40 years in the future?
I would say absolutely that a new generation of activists have been sparked already. And this isn't the end. You know, white supremacy won't end in 2020 or 2021. So there will always be a need for the babies to come about and to fight for their future. It does make me hopeful, right? That this younger generation is starting to see that, like, all the things that I didn't learn while I was in school, you know, they have access to social media in a way that I didn't when I was in high school and middle school. So sometimes it makes me think that the information can be transferred in a way that is beneficial, and that they can get to some of these hurdles better than I did, you know, because when I was like 19, 20, and I found out that racism is a much bigger problem than what I knew it was, that it affects every aspect of my life, it was like shocking, and it kind of shook me. But had I been taught that at a younger age, and taught that there are people that have been doing the groundwork, laying the groundwork for me, that have been fighting for me so that I can come and do the work alongside them or behind them for the next generation. And had I known that, you know, this is something that has been fought for, not just like on a political level, not in a respectable way, like MLK, who, no disrespect to MLK, but like in his Sunday's Best, like there are people who were not college educated. There are people who we will never know, who were straight up off the block, from the hood, from the farm, who fought for justice, just like I am now. That if I had known there are people who are regular everyday folk who had been fighting, then maybe I would have been a little bit more prepared and would not have felt so defeated when I first came into this work. And maybe I would have known, or it would have been, I would not have been so shell shocked when I realized that racism and white supremacy affected the way that I was educated, affected the way I saw my hair and my nose and my skin, affected the way money moves or doesn't move throughout my community. You know, if I had known at an earlier age, then maybe I would have been more prepared and maybe had more of an understanding of how to fight against the system instead of feeling like I was starting from scratch, you know, and had to learn so much all at once. It was like a tidal wave coming. But now that these kids have access to that, I do believe that, you know, things are looking up. I'll be optimistic during this time. I know it's hard and very difficult too, but I feel optimistic.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. I am definitely optimistic. I am encouraged seeing over the summer in Monroe County, a number of young Black women started a group called Enough is Enough. And I think I'm optimistic in seeing the energy that they brought and the people that they mobilized. I'm also worried about them. And I don't really consider myself a young activist anymore, I guess. But I just worry being launched into the activism world, I guess, and then all the pressures that are coming at them from all sides. I worry about them getting burnt out. And so, like, the role I see here for older activists is to support them in whatever they're doing and to encourage them and mentor them and basically don't tear them down. So that's been on my mind a lot.
I'd like to end by saying that hope is a choice. And as to whether people will be inspired by this generation of protesters, I don't think that protest inspires protest. Injustice inspires protest. And that's not going away. However, the revolution could come tomorrow, and that's what we're fighting for. We're going to bring it. We're going to make it happen. You've got to, if you don't believe that on some level, then you might as well go, you know, become a venture capitalist. Good night, everybody.
Does anyone else want to offer any closing thoughts?
Yeah, just as a closing thought, just a kernel of an idea. A lot of people sort of make the point and statement that the struggle is eternal. And what that means, you know, to us may be mixed based upon where we're at in our evolution. But for many of us, that means this drive to, you know, do as much as we can in the way that we can, you know, as long as we can do it, and then hand off to the next. But I think some of the best sort of closing word is from Ursula Le Guin, who's a speculative fiction writer. And she makes the point that we live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable, but then so did the divine right of kings. And so what was once a norm doesn't always have to be.
Any other final comments? Oh, sorry, Freya. Go ahead.
I was just going to say any final comment anymore. This has been really great. I really appreciate the chance to hear what you all have thought about this film and about the moment that it speaks to. I feel like I learned something, and I'm really glad that everyone was able to make it for this conversation. I feel like this popcorn format has really taught me a lot about how we can kind of bounce ideas off of each other in order to get someplace that we weren't when we started. So I appreciate everyone kind of pitching in. And if no one else has any more thoughts, I guess we'll turn it back over to Alyssa to close things out with the audience. Alyssa?
Right. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all again, to echo Freya. Thank you so much for joining us for this fantastic conversation. Thank you to the Themester Advisory Committee, particularly Freya Thimsen, our moderator tonight. Thanks to Tracy B., who coordinates the Themester program. And again, thank you, Martin, Rasul, Andrea, Abby, Micol, and Leah for being part of this discussion. And I'd also like to thank the entire IU Cinema team, particularly Brittany, John, Jessica, Elena, Seth, Elizabeth, Will, and David, who have all worked behind the scenes to help make this event possible. We encourage you to visit our website to see our events and other offerings. That's cinema.indiana.edu. The next film in the Themester 2020 Democracy series is the 1954 animated interpretation of George Orwell's classic novella Animal Farm, which screens September 18th through 23rd with a live intro taking place on September 22nd. So to all of you who tuned in, thank you once again for being with us. Be well and be kind to yourselves and others during these challenging times. Thank you all so much and have a great night.